a vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean under the pale morning light of October 25, 1944, held no hint of the carnage that was about to unfold. On the surface, a small, unassuming American flotilla of slow, unarmored ships steamed quietly off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines. These were not the pride of the United States Navy. There were no massive fleet carriers with hundreds of advanced strike fighters, nor were there heavily armored battleships with colossal guns. Instead, there were 6 tiny escort carriers, affectionately and mockingly nicknamed Jeep carriers by their crews. They were thin-skinned merchant ship hulls, topped with wooden flight decks, carrying only a handful of slow aircraft. Guarding them were just 3 destroyers and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts, fragile tin cans with practically no armor, whose hulls could be penetrated by a heavy machine gun. This small task unit was called Taffy 3. Its mission was simple, quiet, and supposedly safe: provide close air support for the troops landing on the beaches of Leyte and patrol the local waters for submarines. Everyone on board believed the real fighting was happening hundreds of miles away. They believed the mighty American Third Fleet, commanded by Admiral William Bull Halsey, was standing guard to the north, blocking the deep water passages and keeping the main Japanese fleet at bay. But they were dead wrong. Unbeknownst to the men of Taffy 3, Admiral Halsey had fallen for a brilliant Japanese decoy. Lured by a fleet of empty Japanese aircraft carriers, Halsey had charged northward with his entire armada of fast battleships and heavy fleet carriers, leaving the vital San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Through this open gateway, under the cover of night, steamed the most powerful surface strike force the world had ever seen. This was the Japanese Center Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. It was a nightmare of steel and high explosives, consisting of 4 massive battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. And leading this terrifying procession was the Yamato, the largest, most heavily armed battleship ever constructed in human history. Her 9 18.1-inch main guns fired shells that weighed as much as an entire passenger car, capable of obliterating targets over 25 miles away. Behind her steamed the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, alongside a deadly screen of cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese goal was simple: slip into Leyte Gulf, slaughter the defenseless American landing troops on the beaches, and destroy the transport ships, ending the American liberation of the Philippines in a single, catastrophic stroke. At 6:37 a.m., the peace of the morning was shattered forever. A lookout aboard an American patrol plane spotted pagoda-shaped masts on the horizon. His radio crackled with a message that sounded so impossible, his superiors initially refused to believe it. He reported sighting Japanese battleships, cruisers, and destroyers closing fast. A few minutes later, the crew of Taffy 3 looked to the northwest and saw the horizon light up. Colossal geysers of water, dyed in distinct shades of red, yellow, and green by Japanese spotting dyes, erupted around the fragile escort carriers. The Japanese were firing at them from 15 miles away. The shells were so massive that their near misses created shockwaves that physically shook the thin steel hulls of the American ships. The speed of the oncoming Japanese fleet was nearly 30 knots, while the top speed of the lumbering escort carriers of Taffy 3 was barely 17 knots. There was no escape. The wind was blowing from the northeast, forcing the American carriers to steam directly toward the advancing Japanese if they want to launch their aircraft. It was a tactical death sentence. In this moment of absolute terror, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, the commander of Taffy 3, realized the gravity of the situation. He had been abandoned. There were no friendly battleships coming to save him. He was facing the supreme surface force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, with nothing but wooden-decked jeep carriers and a handful of tiny destroyers. If the Japanese closed the distance, they would massacre his carriers in minutes and proceed to the landing beaches to slaughter thousands of American troops. Sprague ordered his carriers to turn away, make maximum speed, and launch every single aircraft they had, regardless of what weapons they were carrying. Simultaneously, he ordered his tiny screening ships to lay down a dense, black chemical smokescreen to hide the fleeing carriers from the deadly visual sights of the Japanese gunners. But smoke could only delay the inevitable. The Japanese heavy cruisers were rapidly overtaking the carriers, their heavy shells tearing through the sea and creeping closer to their targets. Then, the commander of one of the tiny American destroyers decided that if he was going to die, he was going to die fighting. His name was Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma and the captain of the Fletcher-class destroyer, USS Johnston. When the Johnston was commissioned, Evans had stood before his crew and delivered a chilling, prophetic promise. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Evans did not wait for orders. He did not hesitate. He looked at the colossal line of Japanese battleships and cruisers, turned to his helmsman, and ordered the Johnston to make a hard turn. The tiny 2,100-ton destroyer broke formation, increased speed to a screaming 36 knots, and charged completely alone into the path of the entire Japanese armada. It was an act of pure, unadulterated madness. To the Japanese, the sight of a single, unarmored destroyer racing toward them must have seemed like an illusion. But Evans was determined to get close enough to fire his 10 short-range torpedoes. The Johnston zigzagged through a torrential downpour of enemy steel. Heavy shells from the Japanese cruisers splashed all around her, but her high speed and erratic maneuvers kept her alive. Evans pushed his ship to the absolute limit, closing the distance to just 10,000 yards. The Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, the flagship of the Japanese cruiser division, was leading the chase. Evans ordered his gunners to open fire with their 5.5-inch guns. The rapid-fire American shells could not penetrate the heavy armor of the Japanese ships, but they rained down on the Kumano's superstructure, turning her bridge into a shredded, bloody mess of fire and metal. At 10,000 yards, Evans ordered the release of all 10 torpedoes. The steel fish leaped from their tubes and raced through the water toward the Japanese line. The Johnston turned hard to escape behind her own smoke screen, but as she did, the torpedoes found their mark. At least one torpedo slammed directly into the bow of the Kumano, blowing it clean off and instantly knocking the heavy cruiser out of the battle. Another Japanese cruiser was forced to drop back to assist her. The single-handed charge of the Johnston had successfully disrupted the entire Japanese advance, buying the fleeing American carriers precious minutes. But such audacity carried a terrible price. As the Johnston emerged from a rain squall, she was suddenly target-locked by the battleship Yamato and the battleship Congo. A salvo of 3 massive 14-inch shells and several 6-inch shells struck the destroyer simultaneously. The impact was catastrophic. The shells tore through the Johnston's thin hull as if it were paper, exploding deep within her engine rooms and aft steering compartments. The ship's speed was instantly cut in half, dropping to just 15 knots, and her power was knocked out, leaving her aft guns useless. The blast was so violent that it sheared off the clothes of the men on the bridge. Commander Evans was severely wounded, his fingers blown off his left hand and his chest peppered with shrapnel, but he refused to go below. Wrapping his bleeding hand in a handkerchief, he continued to shout commands from the open bridge. The Johnston was heavily listing, her decks covered in dead and wounded, and she was burning fiercely. Yet, against all odds, she was still afloat. As the Johnston, shattered and burning, limped into the protective cover of a rain squall, the surviving crew worked frantically in the dark, flooded compartments to restore partial steering and power, somehow getting her back up to 17 knots. But the battle was far from over. As the Japanese fleet continued to press its advantage, Admiral Sprague realized that the Johnston's heroic sacrifice must not be in vain. He broadcasted a desperate, historic order to his remaining screen: form, column, and attack with torpedoes. The destroyers USS Hoel and USS Heermann, along with the tiny destroyer escort USS Samuel B. received the command. They knew this was a suicide mission. Destroyer escorts were even smaller than destroyers, built with single-shaft engines, and designed only to hunt submarines. They were nicknamed the Tin Can Soldiers. But without a moment's delay, these 3 ships turned around and charged directly into the monstrous wall of Japanese steel. Joining the battered Johnston, the USS Hoel led the charge, drawing the concentrated fire of multiple Japanese battleships. Her captain, Commander Leon Kintberger, guided his ship through a literal forest of towering water splashes. Shells hit the hull repeatedly, knocking out her guns and her radio. But she continued forward until she was close enough to launch her torpedoes at the battleship Congo, forcing the massive Japanese ship to turn away to avoid them. Under a merciless barrage, the hull was hit over 40 times by heavy caliber shells, turning her into a floating furnace. Yet, her crew continued to fire her remaining guns until she finally rolled over and sank. Behind her, the USS Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, charged so close to the Japanese battleships that the Japanese gunners could not depress their massive barrels low enough to hit her. The Heermann fired a spread of torpedoes directly at the Haruna, then turned and launched more at the Yamato itself. The sight of these deadly wakes forced the giant Yamato to turn north to run away from the torpedoes, taking Admiral Kurita's flagship out of the main battle for over 10 crucial minutes. Meanwhile, the tiny destroyer escort USS Samuel B. commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, was performing miracles. Copeland told his crew over the intercom that they were entering a fight against overwhelming odds from which they were not expected to survive, but they would do as much damage as possible. The Roberts, armed with only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes, charged the heavy cruiser Chikai. She got so close that the Choki's heavy guns could not target her. The Roberts unleashed her torpedoes, striking the Chikai and causing massive damage. For over an hour, the Roberts fired her 5-inch guns so fast and so continuously that the gun barrels literally melted. When the power failed, the gun crew manually loaded and fired the final shells by hand. Eventually, the heavy cruiser Tone targeted the Roberts with her 8-inch guns, tearing the small ship apart. As the Roberts began to sink, the surviving crew members sang hymns as they abandoned ship. Having secured their place in history as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship above this chaotic surface battle, a different kind of heroism was unfolding in the skies. The pilots of Taffy 3, flying slow Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers, were launching relentless, savage attacks on the Japanese fleet. Many of these planes had been loaded with light anti-personnel bombs or depth charges meant for submarines, which did little damage to armored ships. But the pilots did not care. They dropped their light ordnance on the Japanese superstructures, destroying bridge equipment and anti-aircraft guns. When they ran out of bombs and torpedoes, they did not fly away. They performed dummy strafing runs, diving straight down through intense anti-aircraft fire toward the Japanese battleships, forcing them to turn and maneuver constantly. Some pilots flew so close that they shot at the Japanese bridges with their service pistols. This unyielding, ferocious air assault, combined with the chaotic smoke screens and the suicidal charges of the destroyers, completely blinded Admiral Kurita to the true nature of his enemy deep within the bridge of the Yamato. Admiral Kurita was growing increasingly confused and frustrated because of the sheer ferocity, aggressiveness, and tactical organization of the American defense. Kurita was convinced that he was not fighting a tiny task force of escort carriers and fragile destroyers. He believed he had stumbled directly into Halsey's main Third Fleet. He thought he was trading fire with massive Enterprise-class fleet carriers and heavily armored cruisers. The smokescreens, the relentless air attacks, and the devastating torpedo runs had shattered the cohesion of his fleet. His ships were scattered, communication was failing, and 3 of his heavy cruisers, the Kumano, Chikai, and Suzuya, had been fatally crippled or sunk by a handful of tiny American tin cans. Back on the surface, the battered USS Johnston was making her final stand. Despite having only one functional gun and a shattered hull, Commander Evans spotted a division of Japanese destroyers closing in to launch a final, lethal torpedo attack on the surviving American carriers. Evans ordered his limping ship to intercept them. The Johnston charged the entire destroyer division, firing her single remaining gun so rapidly that the Japanese destroyers were forced to launch their torpedoes prematurely, missing the carriers entirely. But this was the end for the Johnston. Surrounded on all sides, 5 Japanese ships closed in and pelted the helpless destroyer with continuous gunfire. At 10:10 a.m., Evans finally ordered his crew to abandon ship. As the Johnston slowly rolled over and began to sink, a Japanese destroyer passed close by. Instead of firing on the survivors in the water, the Japanese captain stood on the bridge, removed his cap, and saluted the sinking American ship and her brave crew. Commander Ernest Evans did not survive the sinking, but his actions had saved the entire American invasion force. At 9:11 a.m., just as Admiral Sprague was preparing for the final, inevitable destruction of his surviving carriers, the impossible happened. the Japanese ships suddenly stopped firing. They turned around and began to head north, retreating toward the San Bernardino Strait. Unable to comprehend the fanatical resistance of Taffy III and fearing that the rest of the American fleet was closing in to trap him, Admiral Kurita had decided to break off the engagement and retreat. Against all human logic, the tiny escort carriers and their fragile tin cans had defeated the most powerful battleship fleet ever assembled. The Battle of Samar went down in history as one of the greatest naval mismatches and military stands. It proved that no amount of heavy armor or colossal firepower can overcome the sheer, unyielding courage of men who refuse to surrender. The era of the giant battleship was officially ended, not by rival battleships, but by the pilots of wooden-decked jeep carriers and the crew of the tiny destroyers who fought like giants. As the smoke cleared over the blood-soaked waters of the Philippine Sea, the legend of Taffy III was etched into naval lore forever. The desperate gamble had succeeded, cementing a legacy where the smallest vessels of the fleet rose to become its most formidable defenders, leaving behind an immortal story of survival and sacrifice.